Tonight's special lecture. I'm Nairi Woods, Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government. Joe, we're very lucky at the school to have Joseph Nye as a visiting professor, and we're delighted to see him each year. Joe is one of Oxford's own. I'm sure Joe has been associated with many, many organisations, and we all claim him for our own, but that's a good thing. He came here as a Rhodes Scholar a few years ago and did PPE at Oxford. He has simultaneously served as a professor mostly at Harvard, teaching each generation of American policymakers, and in and out of government, chairing the National Intelligence Committee and in all kinds of other roles in government, seamlessly bringing the practical questions of government back to the towers of academia and bringing some of the research and learning from academia into the halls of government. I think anyone that's been concerned with American power will have read Joe's regular reflections, all wonderfully readable, in a whole series of books on reflections on whether American power is declining, rising, persisting, smart, soft, whatever its quality. Joe's other quality is that he's always at the head of the curve. If it's digital government, if it's whatever is the current challenge of government. And so it's a real pleasure, Joe, to get to you tonight on cybersecurity and cyber warfare. Thank you very much for visiting us once again, Joe. Joe will speak for probably about half an hour and then take questions from you all. Would you join me in welcoming Professor Joe Nye?
Thank you, Nairi, and it's very nice to be back at Oxford, and of course to be here at Blavatnik, which is a great success. And in terms of entrepreneurs and academic entrepreneurs, Nairi Woods is right up in the top ranks. I mean, look what she's created in such a short time. So it's a real pleasure to be here, but I appreciate the generous introduction. But it reminds me that when my children were younger and people would call the house and they'd say, "Is Dr. Nye there?" The boys would say, "Yes, but he's not the useful kind." And if you think about the idea that I'm going to talk to you about cyber tonight, you say, how extraordinary. He's going to talk about something he knows nothing about. People my age generally don't think about cyber or know much about it. And I always say I'll never be a cyber native like my grandchildren are. I'm always going to be a cyber immigrant with a heavy accent. But even immigrants can serve as translators. So I see my function in this area as trying to translate between technical people who are not particularly attuned to the traditions of international politics and international relations and so forth, and to go back and forth between traditional concepts and the new concepts, cyber. And that's led me to publish on various aspects of how you apply international regime theory or cooperation theory to cyber, but I've also been looking particularly at security questions and the issues of how do you think about traditional concepts in security, and one of the most important, of course, is deterrence. And does it make sense to think of deterrence in the cyber area? Richard Betts, a distinguished political scientist at Columbia, wrote an article in which he argued that deterrence doesn't work in cyberspace because there's no return address. If deterrence is worked by the threat of retaliation, but you don't know where the attack came from, so you don't know who to retaliate against, then how do you have deterrence? So there's been a bit of a conventional wisdom for a while in which the general view was deterrence didn't work in cyber. And indeed, if you look at the Department of Defense, the Pentagon in the U.S., and the statements that have been made by the department, if you look in 2011, or 2010 rather, William Lynn, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, wrote an article which was in Foreign Affairs, in which he said, we can't rely on retaliation because there basically is no return address. And the Defense Department's defense statement in 2011 also said, essentially, we have to rely on defense, not deterrence. But by 2015, that's changed in the department's statement. So there has been some changes in thinking here. But I think the interesting point is to ask, if we don't have deterrence, how are we going to deal with the security problems that we're seeing developed as a result of the rapid growth of the internet? And people will say, well, you know, what's the problem? The internet is a technology that's nearly half a century old. But that's misleading because it's true in a technical sense. But if you look at the security problems related to cyber, they're really only about 2 decades old. If you did a little chart of internet users and you looked at 1996 or 20 years ago, you'd find that 0.5% of the global population was on the internet. Today, half the global population, or nearly half the global population, is on the internet. And what's more, with the development of the web, the internet has become a substratum for all sorts of activities, economic, social, political, and otherwise. And by one estimate of a recent commission, the internet is now responsible for some $4 trillion contribution to the global economy. So you have an extraordinary change that's occurring, and it's occurring very, very rapidly. The first 50 years, if you want, the curve goes rather flat along the bottom, and then like a hockey stick, it just takes off. And it's going to get worse. The Internet of Things, which is going to connect various devices to the internet, has been estimated conservatively at meaning that there'll probably be about 20 billion connections to the internet in 2020. So if you go from 16 million individual users in 20 years ago to 20 billion connections 2 years from now or 3 years from now, that's an extraordinary change. Now, anytime you have that degree of change, it creates puzzles for societies or societies' international relations. And it creates a great deal of interdependence, much of which is beneficial economically, socially. But with interdependence goes power, as Bob Cohane and I wrote some half a century ago. And with power and interdependence, you develop vulnerability. And with vulnerability, you suddenly have security problems. So the old type of problems that somebody releases a Mars worm, which interferes with one or two researchers' computers in the 80s, you know, that was there. But that's very different from the security problem we face now, which is the whole substrate of our major systems, economic, political, and military, now rest on something where there's enormous vulnerability, and we don't know quite what to do about it. There's an extraordinarily wide range of attacks, but be careful when you hear the word attack, it's very loosely used. For example, by one count issued by the Pentagon, they suffered 10 million attacks a day on their network systems. Now, that could be any fool or any kid just trying to see if they can get into a web page or deface it or something. So computer experts or cyber experts generally distinguish between what they call computer network exploitation and computer network attack. Computer network exploitation means to go in and get information which you use for your own purposes, but not for destruction. Computer network attack means you're not just trying to get access to the information, you're trying to use or manipulate the information for other purposes. And there's been an increase in the number of computer expert attacks. They call this CNE and CNA. And CNA, your computer network attacks, recent dramatic examples that you've read about in the press would be the case of Estonia in 2007, which had a distributed denial of service attack, which basically shut down the internet in Estonia for a couple of weeks. You also have the Stuxnet attack, in which allegedly the United States and Israel were able to get more than 1,000 Iranian enrichment centrifuges to spin so fast that they destroyed themselves. You also have cases like the war in Georgia in 2008, where the Russians combined their physical attack with a network attack, which deprived the Georgians of communication. But there are also other kinds of things, like the attack by North Korea against the Sony Corporation, or the attack by allegedly Iran against Aramco, destroying some 30,000 computers and their associated data. Or most recently, and I'll come back to this in our discussion near the end of my lecture, the Russian interference in the American 2016 election, which we're still seeing the after effects of. But I could also have added the Russian interference with the Ukrainian electrical grid, so that part of the Ukrainian electrical grid went out because of a Russian hack. So those are examples of computer network attacks as opposed to exploitation. And the question is, what can we do about it? And if deterrence doesn't work, how do we defend ourselves? And I think that one of the problems that we have when somebody like Dick Betts, who I friend and I respect very much, says deterrence doesn't work in the cyber domain, is that they're still thinking of deterrence in the model of nuclear weapons and nuclear warfare. And that's the wrong way to think about deterrence in the cyber arena. With nuclear deterrence, it's all or nothing. I mean, one miss and you're more or less game over, or if not over, at least extraordinary destruction. A better way to think about deterrence in cyberspace is like crime. We try as societies to deter crime. We don't do it perfectly. A number of crimes are committed every day. But we nonetheless feel that the efforts we make to deter help put a limit on crime, or help to give us some limits on that. So if you think of deterrence not as all or nothing in the nuclear sense, but think of deterrence as graduated deterrence, or a gradual process, then I think you can make an argument that deterrence does work in cyberspace. Now, if you go back to Tom Schelling or Glenn Snyder and the classic writings about deterrence in the 60s, you'll find that they say deterrence is the ability to prevent by fear of consequences. But basically, if you can raise the costs of an action to exceed the benefits, then your prevention and deterrence is working. And if you think about that, you go back to this attribution question. If I don't know who done it, how do I raise the price by threat of retaliation? But the attribution question, while it's difficult, is not quite as difficult as it's sometimes made out to be. The problem is a matter of degree, not all or nothing. I mean, Donald Trump famously said in one of the debates during the 2016 campaign that he didn't know who hacked into this. It could be anybody, including a 400-pound kid sitting on his bed. And the argument is, yes, you can always have false flags, you can disguise the route of attack and so forth. But people who work this problem carefully have developed capacities to trace back attacks hop by hop, and you'd be surprised how many hops from one computer to another they can trace back. However, even when you get back to what you think is the original computer from which the attack originated, you still are getting back to a machine, not necessarily to an individual or to the organization which did it. So there are problems and complexities of attribution, but you want to distinguish the question of whether you can attribute something with the 100% surety that you want for a court of law, or whether you want to attribute something with a high enough probability that you can credibly threaten an opponent. And in that sense, attribution is a problem which is real, but it's not as much of a showstopper as people think. What's more, if you think of deterrence in this way in which I've described it as a more gradual process rather than all or nothing, then you realize that there are different mechanisms, political mechanisms, by which you raise the costs of actions higher than the opponent will be willing to pay. And those mechanisms include, and I'll talk about these in a minute, not just punishment, but also denial, entanglement, and norms and taboos. And the reason I mention that is that very often people who are thinking only about punishment forget these other three mechanisms, political mechanisms, which are actually very important in cyber. And what's particularly interesting is this problem of attribution, which is supposed to be a showstopper on cyber, affects the retaliation mechanism, doesn't affect denial or entanglement, and only to some extent norms and taboos. So again, the attribution problem is a major problem, but it's not the showstopper that some people have assumed it to be. Now, if you go back to classic deterrence, and remember deterrence is a long-standing strategy in international politics, goes way back before Hiroshima. I mean, it's as old as human history. But the classic way of thinking about deterrence was that it had two major components. One was threat of retaliation, and the other was denial. And denial meant that you put up defenses that were so good that even though they might eventually be penetrated, they were just too expensive. In other words, it just wasn't worth it. So the classic way of thinking about deterrence was punishment and denial. Those are still components, two of the four mechanisms that work in deterrence in cyberspace. But I'm going to add two more. Some people who have read my writings on this said, oh, you're concept stretching or you're taking deterrence too far, so forth. I don't worry that much about the semantics. What I'm interested in is what are the political processes which can help prevent people from attacking us. And so I'm going to use the word deterrence to be any situation where you're able to increase the costs beyond the benefits for the potential attacker. But let's start with the classic deterrence, which is threat of punishment. Sometimes people think that cyber deterrence means that if you attack my system, my cyber system, I respond by attacking through some sort of cyber response. That's not a very useful way of thinking about it. There's no reason that you have to respond to a cyber attack by a cyber response. In fact, the most effective ways to respond are what's called cross-domain deterrence. In other words, if I have to restrict my repertoire of tools to respond to you solely to cyber tools, I'm unnecessarily restricting myself. But if I can use a whole larger quiver or have full of arrows of different types, like sanctions or like military actions, then I can do a lot more. So when we think about punishment, we have to realize that the punishment is not just that I fry your computer when you injure mine. It's that I say, if you do something which is very destructive, like bring down my electrical grid. And, you know, if the grid goes down in Chicago in February, that's a lot of deaths for people freezing. And there has been a lot of talk about Leon Panetta, when he was Secretary of Defense, warned against a cyber Pearl Harbor, for example. And so the question is, if you really lost your electrical grid at a crucial time, how would you respond? Would not necessarily by stopping the Russian or Chinese or Iranian electrical grids. You might respond by a military attack. And indeed, the doctrine of the Department of Defense is that we will respond with any tool we want at a level that's proportional to the attack. In other words, that kinetic responses will be in the arsenal, and as the Defense Science Board put it, that arsenal is anchored in nuclear weapons. In other words, if somebody attacks with a cyber attack of such a scale that has the effect of a nuclear weapon, the official doctrine is that we will respond in a proportional way all the way up to the use of nuclear weapons. So punishment and thinking of kinetic equivalence and cross-domain deterrent remains an important part of deterrence in the cyber era. But the second mechanism that we want to think about is denial. The conventional wisdom about cyber is that offense dominates defense, that it's so much cheaper and easier to attack than to defend, that defense is hopeless. But not really. If you can adjust the workload factor so that the attacker finds that his resources are being chewed up and it's just too expensive to be worth attacking you, then you can deter. The attacker says, well, I'll go and find some other way to do something criminal, or if it's terrorist, some other way to strike terror. So denial through effective defense can play a role. Bruce Schneier, who's one of the great cryptographers and experts in this area, has said, you know, when you look at how we deter crime, you'll see that we do it through a whole series of denial approaches, and that's as true for cyber as it is for street crime. And the interesting question is it then leads you to realize that part of defending against things like the WannaCry ransomware attack that we all read about a couple of weeks ago can be solved in part by thinking in terms of a public health model. In other words, if you've got a better level of hygiene in cyber, you could remove about 80% of the potential attacks. Right now, somebody can go on the dark web and purchase a program which would allow them to use a botnet for a distributed denial of service, or to buy a program for attacking you with ransomware or whatever. But if everybody raised the level of their protection, or their hygiene, to dual authentication, and made sure that they patched every time a patch came through, some estimates are that you could get rid of about 80% of potential attackers. The so-called script kiddies or common criminals who are going through Tor to the dark web and buying something for a few $100s, it's no longer going to work. Indeed, if you look at the WannaCry, if more people had either gotten rid of their Windows XP or patched it, then it wouldn't have worked. I mean, and if you ask where did this attack of the WannaCry have its biggest effects, it was in underfinanced health systems where people hadn't poured enough money into updating the computer systems, or in countries which had a long tradition of stealing technology, Russia and China, where rather than pay licenses to Microsoft, they just ripped off Microsoft. So they were still using XP, but the XP was not being patched. Microsoft had given up surfacing it, and the price of that was that they were vulnerable. That's an excursion to say that hygiene, raising the level overall on a public health model, can be an important part of cyber deterrence. And so the idea that offense dominates defense may be true, but the fact that I can't prevent the Russian GRU from breaking into my system doesn't mean I can't protect against 80% of the people trying to break into my system from doing so. So, number one, the threat of retaliation. For the Russians or the Chinese intelligence services, I have to have that threat of retaliation. But number two, particularly for non-state actors, which are hard to identify, I can get a lot of protection against them by affecting their work factor, by essentially just making it too expensive for them to be able to play in that game. But let me mention two other mechanisms which are more rarely discussed when we talk about deterrence, but I would argue are very important. One is what I call entanglement. If you go back to the literature on nuclear deterrence, people like Bob Jervis and others have written that this is self-deterrence. I don't attack you because I will hurt myself. And sometimes people think, oh, well, you know, self-deterrence, that doesn't matter. Actually, it matters tremendously. If you ask the question of why, for example, does China not do more of attacking the United States? Because if it did, it would find that it was hurting the Chinese economy. In other words, it would feed back into affecting Chinese economic growth. So China has an incentive not to bring down the American electrical grid because it needs to export to the United States. And even if the United States didn't find out that it was China who did it and didn't retaliate, nonetheless China would suffer anyway because the Americans would be less able to buy Chinese goods. And so there's a dyadic or two-state aspect of entanglement. There's also a systemic aspect of entanglement. There's a enormous number of unknowns about the complexity of the consequences of an attack on the internet. They're unintended consequences in systems that aren't fully mapped or thoroughly understood. So if you have an attack and it brings down much more than you thought you were attacking, then you might find you have less ability to use the internet, and that hurts you. For example, it's said that in 2003, when the United States was attacking the air defense system of Iraq before its invasion of Iraq, or in 2011, when it was attacking the Libyan air defense system before the bombing related to the attack on Benghazi, that the U.S. had the capacity and considered the capacity of taking these out by cyber means, but didn't. And one argument is that they didn't understand the full systemic effects. There's an argument that says that the whole French ATM system ran on the same software that was common to the Iraqi air defense system, so that in destroying the Iraqi air defense system for a purpose of allowing planes to fly through, you might have shut down banking in France. But that's a systemic effect of entanglement, if you like. So that's the third mechanism, which is entanglement. The fourth mechanism is norms and taboos. We sometimes say, well, you know, norms don't matter. They're violated all the time, except they do matter. Remember, at one time, it was regarded as plausible to use nuclear weapons. Indeed, in the early days, nuclear weapons, the Americans developed a system called the Honest John, interesting phrase, which was a backpack nuclear weapon that an infantryman could carry on the battlefield. And the argument was this is the only way to prevent the Soviets from sweeping across the Fulda Gap and the North German Plain and so forth. It didn't take too long for people to realize this was kind of a dumb idea, but it does illustrate that there was a view of nuclear weapons as usable. Today, at least in most countries, we don't know about North Korea, nuclear weapons are regarded as almost unusable, except in extremis. And Tom Schelling, who I mentioned earlier, but a distinguished Nobel laureate who spent a good deal of his career thinking about deterrence in these issues, Tom Schelling used to say the most important thing that's happened in the past 75 years is the development of a taboo against the use of nuclear weapons. And that's interesting because it's an existence theorem that taboos can make a difference. Now, can you develop taboos in the cyber era, norms and taboos? And one problem is it's very hard to distinguish a cyber weapon from a normal program. We could have the same code, the same program, and it could be a weapon or not a weapon depending on use. For example, if there's a code which unlocks your iPhone, and if I deprive you of it, I can deprive you of your access to your data, but when you can use it, it's a useful code. And also you can change just a single statement in a program very simply to change something which might seem to be innocent to a malware. So if people say, what about a ban on certain malware or certain cyber weapons, that image, which is like nuclear arms control, just doesn't work. You can't tell. There's no way to verify that. So the argument that there's nothing to be done to develop a taboo has been expressed. But what's interesting, if you look what people have been working on in the UN group of government experts, which reported in 2015, and which includes all the major cyber-capable countries, they said we can create a taboo against not weapons, but against targets. In other words, I can't tell you whether this code is a weapon or not a weapon, but I can tell you that if I find your malware in a hospital electrical system, that's a violation. And so the UNGGE, in its report in 2015, actually came up with an agreement that states would not use cyber weapons against civilian targets. And that's an extension of something we know quite well, which is the laws of armed conflict. Under the laws of armed conflict, which govern our behavior in war, you have to observe proportion and discrimination, which means not attacking civilians. And you say, but who, nobody pays attention to that. On the contrary, if you are a soldier in the American Army or the British Army, you can go to jail if you violate that. And people have been prosecuted for it. So the laws of armed conflict are taken seriously, even if they're sometimes violated. And one of the interesting questions is, will this approach, which is to not try to have taboos and norms against particular weapons, but against the use of any weapon against particular targets, is an interesting approach. We don't yet know how it'll work. It has been endorsed by the Group of 20 and heads of state and taken to the UN General Assembly. So not a nothing. So if you think about that, then I've suggested to you that rather than the view that there's no way to defend ourselves in a cyber area, there actually are 4 ways. But we have to get out of our mind this all or nothing approach of retaliation against a nuclear attack, which I think has stunted our thinking about deterrence in cyberspace. So if we look at this, you can see in this table about the who, how, what of cyber deterrence and dissuasion. The how I've already described through punishment, denial and defense, entanglement, norms and taboos. But that raises the question of deterrence depends on context. And that's not just true of cyber, it's true of any case. For example, cyber deterrence might be likened to extended deterrence during the Cold War. People would say, well, you can't defend Berlin. Nobody would sacrifice New York for Berlin. And yet, for 40 years, we did defend Berlin, even though it was an enclave surrounded by Soviet troops. And on the other hand, if you say, well, that proves that just having some threat is a good way to have deterrence, well, that didn't prevent the Soviets from invading Afghanistan. And the difference there, of course, is that the credibility of the stakes were so much different in Berlin than they were in Afghanistan. So deterrence depends very much upon context. And that's why if somebody says, does deterrence work in cyberspace, there are these 4 mechanisms. But whether it works or not depends on whether you're talking about a state or a non-state actor, whether it's a small state or a large state. Entanglement might stop China, but it probably won't stop North Korea, which is not integrated into the international system. And norms and taboos may inhibit major states, but not some non-states. And similarly, when you say what, you may be able to deter the major use of force, something like the cyber Pearl Harbor, and you may be able to deny or defend against some crime and hacking when it's a set of criminals, but not when it's the GRU from the Russia. And similarly, entanglement may help against the major use of force, but not about conditions which are below the level of armed conflict. And that brings us to the interesting puzzle that I want to turn to next, which is I've tried to establish that the threat of a cyber Pearl Harbor and the ability to use deterrence against a major attack, which is the equivalent of an armed attack, that does exist, and that these views that there's no way to defend ourselves is wrong. But there's an interesting question, which is suppose you have attacks which are in the gray zone below the levels of armed conflict. And a great example of this would be the North Korean attack against Sony Pictures, which was an attack by a government against a corporation about the use of or showing of a film which was disrespectful of the dictator of North Korea. That's not armed conflict. In fact, President Obama called it vandalism, which may not be adequate either. But the point is that it's in this gray zone. Perhaps more serious than that was the Russian interference in the 2016 election, in which the Russians not only conducted information operations, and there's nothing new about information operations, but they actually entered into the political process by hacking into the email system of Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, John Podesta, and then leaking out this information in ways which damaged the momentum of her political campaign. And so that was more than just broadcasting attacks. It was actually breaking into systems to try to skew the election results. And some people have said, well, there's nothing you can do about this. That deterrence will work above the or at the LOAC level, but this blank area I have down here, the gray zone, there's nothing that can be done. I don't think that's quite right, but it does raise interesting puzzles. To give you another example, in this gray zone area, the United States had been arguing for years that China was using cyber means to steal the intellectual property of American companies. And the Chinese would say, first, we don't do it. And then when you push them on that, they say, well, you do it to us. And we'd say, no, we don't. We may spy on you all the time, but we're not giving it to American companies to use for commercial advantage. And so the Americans and the Chinese had a dialogue of the deaf back and forth on this for years. And then in 2015 or 2014, the United States arrested or indicted, not arrested because they were outside jurisdiction, indicted 5 PLA officers for entering American systems, stealing intellectual property and transferring it. The Chinese are very annoyed by this. They broke off relations in a small committee that was between the State Department and the Foreign Ministry. Nothing happened. Then the American administration issued an executive order, Obama issued an executive order, in which he said we were going to make a regular practice of sanctions against people who could be identified as having broken into American systems. And the president sent his national security advisor to China and said, we have a summit coming up in September, and if you want that summit to succeed, you're going to have to change your position on this. We're tired of talking to you about this. You either change or this is a failure. That meant China, thinking back to the mechanism of entanglement, said this is getting too expensive. Whatever benefits we're getting from stealing this intellectual property, it's now gotten The Americans have escalated it through cross-domain threat of retaliation to a level where it's too expensive. The net effect of that was at the September 2015 summit between Obama and Xi Jinping. The Chinese changed their position of declaratory policy 180 degrees, having for years said there's nothing wrong with stealing intellectual property, and the Americans having said, you want us to trade with you freely, it's wrong for you to skew the system. They agreed to make a distinction between cyber intrusions for normal espionage, preparing the battlefield or whatever, and cyber intrusions for commercial purposes. So Xi and Obama signed an agreement not to do that. They then took that to the group of 20, where it was agreed to by the whole group of 20. And I'm told by friends who monitor these things carefully that Chinese behavior has changed. Some people said, oh, the Chinese will just, they'll say this, but they won't change their behavior. But in fact, it appears that Chinese behavior has come. So there's a case in which the threat of sanctions in the gray zone, below the level of armed conflict, led to a major change in behavior by a major state. But notice the difference between the Chinese example and the Russian example I gave you. In the Russian example, there's very little entanglement. In the Chinese example, there's a lot of entanglement. So the various mechanisms of deterrence, one fits one case, but not the other case. So what I'm trying to argue is that as we think about deterrence in cyberspace, we've got to get away from the old imagery of nuclear deterrence, the all or nothing, the Big Bang or not. And we also have to realize that the answer to the question of does deterrence work in cyberspace, it depends on these factors. Who, what, and what are the circumstances as to which of these mechanisms may work, and policymakers then who are trying to develop a strategy for defending ourselves in this era of much greater interdependence and vulnerability through cyber world are going to have to become much more subtle in developing strategies than just taking the old concepts of nuclear deterrence and trying to transfer them into cyberspace. So that's my effort to be a digital immigrant who translates from the nuclear era to the cyber era. So let me stop there and throw it open for your questions or even better, objections. I've befuddled everyone. Yes. Familiar face.
I hope I can understand you can understand my accent. I wonder if you could comment on...
Is that a Kennedy School accent?
I wonder if you could comment on the difference between a hack where a country goes to another country and reveals true information that's been kept confidential that is damaging to an election or a ruling party. Second, where they take information and exaggerate it, make it look worse. Or third, what is purported to be true in the Qatar case, maybe it's the second case, where they actually plant false information, which then leads to conflict. Could you separate those cases?
Yeah, what we are seeing is most behavior in cyber so far has been doxing, in which you take information and you release it to the public to embarrass. Or you may lock up information, as in ransomware. So one is you take unauthorized information and embarrass. The other is you prevent people getting access to their information. Thus far, we haven't seen something that we're likely to see a lot more of, which is interfering with the integrity of information. So you go into the system, you don't let them know you're in there if you can help it. You don't release it, you don't lock it up, you just change your blood type from O or negative to positive. And next thing you know, you die. or or the argument on the driverless cars. You find ways in which you change the information on the map of your car, so you drive off the road, or your car does. So the integrity of information, which means you don't release it, you don't lock it up, you just make a little change, I think is something we're going to see more of in the future. And I think that's particularly insidious and particularly dangerous. And then the question is, well, how do you protect against that? To some extent, if it's done by Trump's 400-pound kid sitting on the bed, or the script kiddie, as they're sometimes called, you do it through my denial mechanism with a public health metaphor. You just make it very hard for people to get programs that will allow them to do that. They're going to have to be smart enough to write a very sophisticated program. And that's where advanced intelligence agencies come in. When you take a program like the one that was used in Stuxnet, or the program that was used to shut down the Ukrainian electrical grid, that is not available to the script kiddie or to the person who goes on the dark web and tries to buy a prepackaged thing. It requires an intelligence service which knows a lot of detail about the processors that are used in different machines, how they're made, how you can change them. And it also, in the case of Stuxnet, involved the ability to overcome a common defense, which is the so-called air gap. The air gap means don't connect a vulnerable system to the internet. And so what you do is make sure that if you have a vulnerable system, which is very important to you, you don't connect it to the internet. So if you have this health data, which could be messed up by somebody changing the integrity of the data, just to make sure that that is on a separate set of servers or is not connected to the internet or so forth. Trouble is, air gaps can be defeated by humans. So the various vectors of attack in cyber, we've talked mostly this afternoon about attack through networks, but another direction of attack is through supply chains. You build in malware into the machinery. And the third is humans. You get a human to take a thumb drive out of his or her pocket and slip it into the machine. Once you do that, you've defeated the air gap. And the malware then is inserted directly into the machine. So there are several vectors of attack for cyber threats. I didn't go into the other ones in great detail, but the point is that we are likely to see more attacks on the integrity of data. And this is going to be particularly difficult because of this Internet of Things. There's just going to be so many routes into our data that if a company is in the business of trying to sell us Alexa or somebody, or a talking refrigerator or whatever you want, that and they can buy a cheap processor which costs $20, or they can buy a expensive processor for $200, which is reprogrammable and patchable. In competition, they're likely to do the first. But the externalities are left for the public in insecurity. And the question is, how do we get a system where there's an incentive for companies to put in that fancier processor? And those are the threats that we face in the future. So if you say, how do you respond to that? Well, part of my hygiene model is to make sure that we have laws about liability and policies regarding insurance that make it a lot harder to get into those systems. But will somebody be able to get in if they're a Chinese intelligence or the NSA? Probably yes. Yeah. Yes.
I want to thank you for coming here. Mark Kilbane, I'm a student here. I want to get back to one of your original contentions was the idea that we cannot strike back. That's the conventional wisdom. How can you operate when you can't strike back? And we mentioned information operations. You said there's absolutely nothing new there. So you have, in psychological operations, you've got white, gray, and black. White, you tell them the truth, just not all the truth. In gray, you don't attribute it to anything. And in black, you actually plant false information. But in the case, for example, of the Russian hacking of the election, the Russian ambassador to the United Kingdom occupied that same space that you're in now, and he said there is absolutely not one shred of proof of Russia's involvement. So we have this attribution problem, don't we? And perhaps in that sort of environment, 3 out of your 4 responses are off the table. And if you cannot, for example, in the case of the Chinese, you mentioned that they had the names of the PLA officers who were involved in that particular attack. But when the situation is such that the attribution is gray, it seems like the only thing we can do is better hygiene, as you say, or to try to make it too costly, as in your crime analogy, is the only tool we have remaining. So in a case where it's state on state with a sophisticated attacker, we're back to the original problem, which is you can't strike back.
Well, you've described the dilemma properly. The interesting question is, are there policy options that we haven't talked about or thought about yet? Let me give you an example. You could, but just parenthetically, let me say that the heads of all American intelligence agencies said the Russians done it. So I don't know what your Russian ambassador said, but that's a rare statement to make. But yes, leave that aside for a second. If you take a possible approach, you could say to the Russians, okay, we're not adequately entangled as we are with the Chinese to be able to threaten trade relations or whatever. But suppose we say that if you keep doing this, I mean, we have a pretty good idea that you're doing it. It's not, the Russians know that we know, and so what they say for the public consumption is a little different. So and in fact, Obama said to Putin at a G20 meeting, I guess it was, in September 2016, knock it off, but Putin didn't knock it off. But if you say to the Russians, if you continue this kind of behavior, we are going to respond in ways that will produce a proportionate level of pain for you. Now, one thing is, blocking bank accounts and Russian individuals, and that's already being done because of Ukraine. But you might imagine, in addition to that, disclosing the details of where Putin's external finances are located, Swiss bank, UAE bank, so forth. So you can think of a series of things just in information where it embarrasses or is costly to them. And then, or you can threaten that. Then you can say to the Russians, look, you argue that that we do it. That's what color revolutions are. We say you can't do this. We can have an agreement in which we will have information warfare against each other. Voice of America versus RT or something. But anything that gets into the election system is taboo, or there's a norm against that. And if we find you violating that, then we will respond with a set of sanctions which will cause pain, which will be more painful to you than the costs. So it's not impossible to think through some responses. I mean, you don't have to be, you describe the situation accurately, you don't have to stop there. And you could even imagine, and the Russians, of course, would then come back and say, but then you've got to promise not to have broadcasts in Ukraine or in Georgia or whatever. And we say, well, no, we can't promise that, but we will promise you that we don't do things which let's say, stimulate or stir up problems at the time of your elections. So there may be some ways in which you set boundaries. Remember, on the Chinese example, we didn't prohibit espionage. Chinese are spying on us all the time. We're spying on them all the time. We knew that if you tried to block or prohibit espionage, it wouldn't work. I mean, states have used espionage since time immemorial. But if you said espionage for this niche, for commercial purposes, violates the fair play that underlies our trade relationship, which is in this entanglement, there you were able to get an agreement. So it might be possible to get something in the case of the Russians. David?
Thanks very much. You've given this talk as someone who comes from the hegemon, and I wonder if there's a multilateral set of issues that call for a multilateral agency institution construction to symmetrically manage the kind of issues that you've talked about essentially as the hegemon managing in this lecture.
Well, I think if you look at the example of the UN group of government experts trying to develop a code of conduct, that is not hegemonic. That is a development of, I guess there were 20 states involved in the group, and the question is, will those codes work without any enforcement, without any threat of responses? But the fair responses can come from others than just the U.S. But I think you could imagine over time trying to develop rules of the road or codes of conduct which will set limits on cyber conflict. And it's particularly interesting if you go back, I've written a different article on this, if you go back to the nuclear analogy, it took states about 20 years after 1945 before we had the first arms control, which was the Limited Test Ban Treaty in '63. That's about 2 decades. Well, if you ask where are we in cyber, well, we're about 2 decades from when the hockey stick turns upward. Not from the invention of the technology, but from when the interdependence creates this enormous vulnerability. And then you say, well, where were the areas in the nuclear deterrence era where cooperation developed on 2 things, which were positive-sum games rather than zero-sum games. One was the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which was, in a sense, an environmental treaty. We're all breathing this or suffering from this strontium-90. And the other was, in 1968, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was an agreement against third parties, new proliferators. So from the point of view of the arms control agreements, the areas were ones where they were basically either game against nature or game against others. And if you ask what's the equivalent to that in cyber, this is an article I wrote called Nuclear Lessons for Cyber. I would argue that the areas of not attacking the central nervous system of the internet, so to speak, is a game against nature. I mean, destroying the domain name system or something would be like the Test Ban Treaty. And similarly, I think cyber crime is ripe for a positive-sum game among among all states, really, because it's the game against non-state actors who are profiting on this. Now, it gets a little bit complicated because some states use criminals as proxies, but leave that complication aside for a minute. But I would argue that the next areas where we should look for progress are protection of the central nervous system of the internet and expanding the cooperation against cybercrime. There are areas where we and other countries like China differ on what's criminal, but then you can limit yourself to areas which are so-called doubly criminal. There are a lot of things that are criminal in China and are criminal in Britain and are criminal in American law, such as ransomware. So I think we should be looking for areas where you can have positive sum games, which are games against nature or games against third parties, and that would be where I would use the nuclear lessons for cyber control. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I'm Gabriela. I'm a student from diplomacy. I'm studying diplomacy here. And I would like to discuss about how to apply cyber deterrence in cases like the US virus called, I don't know if I'll say properly with the right accent, Stuxnet. Yeah.
Stuxnet, yeah.
So in this case, attacking against the Iranian mills, nuclear mills. So how could we apply deterrence in that specific case? And should the international community change their view, for example, reviewing the Article 51 from UN, or bringing a new definition for self-defense nowadays?
Well, as you know, Article 2, Part 3 says you cannot use force against another state, but Article 51 allows self-defense. So and those are two separate thresholds, and there's a lot of ambiguity about how they're applied in practice. That's true in cyber as much as it is in the kinetic world. But what's interesting is that in the case of Stuxnet, which was used allegedly by the United States against Iran, because it argued that Iran was violating its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty in developing a nuclear weapon, the Americans would argue in legal terms, Article 51, self-defense. It's a little bit of a stretch to argue that, but the Iranians could have declared it. They could have gone to the Security Council and said, this is a violation of Article 2.3, and we demand the Security Council, condemn the U.S. for it. The Americans would have vetoed it, so probably not much would happen. But most interesting is the Iranians decided not to declare it an act of war, and so it was treated as cyber sabotage rather than cyber war, and the problem of how do you develop an agreement on this is very difficult. But it's not just in cyber. I mean, if you look at the use of force generally, that's been a long-standing problem of the difference between Article 2 and Article 51. So I don't think. I mean, it's cyber reproduces a problem which is there in the kinetic world. In other words, it doesn't change the nature of it. It does raise, though, an interesting ethical question as opposed to a legal question. If the Americans and the Israelis, fearing an Iranian nuclear weapon, and there was reasonable intelligence that the Iranians were developing a nuclear weapon, if the Americans and the Israelis then had a kinetic strike, in other words, they had bombed all these Iranian plants, there would have been considerable loss of life. By doing this with a cyber attack, there was no loss of life. And some people have said it's better to have a cyber attack with no loss of life than a major kinetic attack with loss of life. And that's an ethical argument, not a legal argument. And some people would argue that if the destruction of the centrifuges helped to encourage Iran to reach that plus sanctions, to reach the agreement not to develop nuclear weapons for 10 years, wasn't that better than if we had had a bombing campaign? So legally, it's a mess. Ethically, it's an interesting mess. Malika?
Professor Nye, how integrated would you say that the regime for cyber is? And do you think that its fragmentation or integration influences in any way the robustness of the four political mechanisms that you just described?
Well, there are a set of regimes in cyber, and what I've written about this, I call it a regime complex. So there's not a single hierarchical regime. And so in that sense, it's not a well-integrated regime. But there are rules, and some of the rules are indigenous or endogenous, rather, to the cyber area. For example, the rules that establish the domain name system is purely cyber. Others are imports from other areas. So this agreement to not attack civilian targets by cyber means, that's basically a norm that's existed for a long time, the law of armed conflict, imported into the cyber arena and then adapted for cyber purposes. And there are other examples in trade or intellectual property. So the cyber regime is a hodgepodge of a lot of different norms brought in from different areas. But it's not true that there are no norms so that there isn't a regime complex. Sometimes people say cyber is the Wild West, anything goes. Well, no, it doesn't. There are sets of norms. Right?
I think we've run out of time. Right. I know we could keep Joe here all night, but before I close, Joe, you were for a long time the Dean of Harvard Kennedy School. You've been a fantastic source of wisdom and advice, right from the very first days of trying to build the Blavatnik School of Government, and for that, all of us are very grateful to you. But we're also very grateful for such an illuminating speech this evening. So can you join me in thanking Professor Joseph Nye?